Welcome back to the Triathlon Training Explained Show, powered by Training Peaks. This week, we're looking ahead to race day, and by that, I specifically mean the build-up to it. We're well and truly stuck into race season now, and hopefully you've done the hard work and you're ready to nail your performance. But actually, as much as it's physically hard doing the preparation, it's straightforward. You've got to work hard, you know that. But when it comes to those final few weeks of dialing it in, it's sometimes really difficult to know how much or how little to train in order to get the best performance possible. Getting the taper right is not easy. We're all different, and therefore we require different amounts of rest or stimulus in those final few weeks and few days before a race. Well, we're going to be hearing from the professional athletes and coaches on how they do it, and I'm also going to be discussing my own experiences so that we can guide you towards that perfect pre-race preparation. Okay, before we go any further, I probably should explain exactly what a taper is. Well, basically, it is a gradual decrease in your training load, usually before a race, and this should then combine your peak fitness with your minimum fatigue, which will result in, hopefully, your best possible performance. But it isn't quite that straightforward. There's not one size fits all, and finding that perfect balance between mind and body before a race isn't just a mathematical equation. Well, personally, coming from a swimming background, I was used to racing several times in a season and often in the middle of a really heavy training block. But that said, every year I did have an A race. It was national championships in the summer, and we'd have a really big taper, and that was the main focus. But I very rarely swam a personal best, and on the whole, didn't perform that well. And it turns out that basically it was pretty much down to the taper. And sadly and frustratingly for me, it meant that I actually don't need as much of a rest as some other athletes do. And I actually need to keep that intensity up as much as I didn't really want to admit it. But it just proves that everyone is different and individual. And now moving on to triathlon, it's different again, because the fatigue that you get in your legs from cycling and running lasts much longer than swimming. So I'm still actually trying to figure that one out exactly. But I think it's time we went and spoke to the experts. And I actually earlier caught up with my former coach, Robin Brew, who's coached numerous triathlon and swimming Olympic and world medalists. Cool. So first, Robin, when does one start a taper? What's the timescale?
Everything really depends on the athlete and the amount of work that's been done up until that point. It all depends on you working back to see and find out how much you've done, because tapering off not a lot of work isn't very effective, but tapering off a sustained period of time is effective. In swimming, to give you an example, we will generally start the taper about 3 weeks from a major competition. And in triathlon, the triathletes we work with, we will look at a more specific phase of training, 6 weeks up to an event, with a very detailed 2 week out approach. So,
and why do some athletes perform sort of as well when they've tapered as when they haven't? And sometimes even they might have a better performance when they haven't, in theory, actually tapered. But... Well,
tapering is different for every person, and one of the interesting facts is that two tapers the same never work for the same person. It's all very individualized. It's all down to the craft and the skill of the coach and the athlete to understand their performance ability and understand the training effect that's happened to that point. If you take, again, strip it down to its basic levels, tapering is actually becoming unfit. You're actually losing your fitness as you go into the race. But what you're allowing yourself to do is your energy is increasing, your form is increasing, and your fatigue is reducing. So therefore, you've got these components in a meeting in the middle where you're at your optimum. So it's a case of not losing too much fitness, but just enough to allow these other adaptations to occur to really nail it.
Well, that leads me on to the next question. So how many times in a year can you taper without, having this big loss of fitness?
It depends how significant the competitions are. Generally speaking, people will go for, if it's elite level racing, a maximum of 3 main tapers a year. It can cut down to 2, but you would never want 1, because really you need the practice of tapering, and your body's got to have the practice of adapting to a taper. So, 3 big ones for 3 considerable events are proper taper where it's really specced out is a good idea. Now, what I do is I throw loads of mini tapers in, because a mini taper can be done over 3 days. So you can get an effect of adaptation in a short period of time. Again, depending on what you've done, but it's all about understanding the requirements of the race, what kind of work you've put in place up to that point, and how your body adapts. And it's the formula of working the right rest to the right intensity.
And how do you prevent loss of fitness, or you just manage around it? I mean, it's a strange question, but you talked about it, and people watching this might go, but we don't want to get unfit before the race, and I know it's completely different to performance, but what would you say to someone who says that, and how do you prevent loss of fitness over the season from tapering?
Yeah, well, your followers will know that they've had some amazing races where they've least expected it, and they felt probably not as fit as they should have been. And fitness and being fast are two different things. The body is a very clever bit of kit, and it needs that ability to have recovered from something to perform. It's the tightrope we walk in performance sport is exactly that balance, is how much of each commodity. But the deal is that you have to retain your intensity. So, for example, it's not uncommon for triathletes at elite level to put a very, very hard specific training on the Wednesday before they race. But they will make that one component the only meaningful component that week. The other stuff is skills and drills, maintenance work, recovery sessions, but a really solid 20-minute, for example, 10-mile time trial is a perfect midweek thing if you're racing on a Sunday, because your body's then recognize the muscle fiber recruitment, recognize that the intensity it's got to work to, it's familiar with that, it meets the demands, and then the next few days are about recovering from that and getting ready to go again. So the idea of resting completely, it will put you in a bit of a hole that you can't get out of. It's about resting enough with the right components in the sessions.
But why is that? So say you've worked really hard all year and you think, yes, my race is next week and I want to be rested. So I'm going to put my feet up and I'm going to do nothing all week. Why is that bad? Why do we not perform well if we've had a week's rest?
Yeah, well, it's your body is no different to a Formula One vehicle. It's if you just leave the race car in the garage for a week without firing up, getting all your systems working, everything is optimized. If you've done all that work, you've got an optimization and an engine that is used to being work. You've got to keep that going. You've just got to allow the physiology of the performance of the race to come to the fore, which is your energy, having enough energy, having enough motivation. And when you start to taper, interestingly, in swimming, performance swimming, we call it the taper blues, because 3 weeks out, first few days into the taper, especially a week into it, your performances just are off the radar in terms of useless. Oh,
I've had that, and it's the most horrible. You panic, don't you? And because you've done all that work and you know that you're in a good shape, but then you start doubting it because you feel awful.
Commit it to paper, because 7 days out, 14 days out, they are critical days. And what you're doing, know your timelines for things, know that the intensity you've got to work at, and if it means that session needs to be done slow and controlled, that needs to be slow and controlled. If that session needs to be intensive, make sure that you get the right the workload for the right duration. It's about reducing the duration of intensity, but actually stepping up the intensity. And that's what people forget. It's I just need to go easy, or I just need to go steady. No, you've got to meet the demands of the race, but actually your body on the general stuff, the maintenance stuff, has got to have a chance to recover and repair.
And so the final question, for athletes that don't have a coach and maybe they're doing their first ever big race, so they've had their first proper block of training and this is their A race of the year, what advice would you give to someone who's sort of doing a taper for the first time? So this is their, yes, they'll learn from it, but this time they want to try and get it as right as possible and they're making their own structure. What tips would you give them?
Right, if somebody is training about, say, 10 hours a week, so, most people can commit to 6 to 10 hours a week out there that have got busy lifestyles, busy jobs, you then have a 10-hour block to play with. You're really looking at reducing that down in the final week by about 40%. So if it's a 10-hour athlete, you're looking to bring your hours down to about 6 hours. So just generally there, you've got a saving of energy expenditure. So that's one thing. And if it is 6 to 10 hours, you haven't got enough in the bank. You've been very consistent, assuming that they've kept this up for 6 to 12 weeks. So therefore, you don't need a long lead-in. You just need a week to 10 days where you start to become much more specific. The sessions, here's an example for a lead-in for the run, for example, is, in the days leading up to it, okay, you might still run a 5K in a session or an 8K in a session, but a lot of that is jogging. However, in the middle of the set, doing 5 repeats of 30 seconds up at the intensity you're going to meet in your race is really important with a 2-minute recovery. So there's small bite-sized bits of intensity that aren't fatiguing the body. The body's able to manage them easily because you've got great consistency through the last 6 weeks, whatever. But you're just being smart about just enough. It's all about just enough. And one final word of advice would be, if in doubt whether you do the session or not, if you feel the slight fatigue, rest. Just don't do it. Is err on the side of caution. Less is more. And it's, I think people get that wrong. They get anxious that if I'm not running today, if I'm not cycling today, if I'm not swimming today, I need to keep on top of it. And then what you end up getting is quite a mediocre race. The body has got to be, it's like a spring. It's got to coil up and then it's got to perform.
Yeah, I think especially triathletes are guilty of that, aren't we? Because we're used to training 3 sports and it's kind of, you always want to be doing more. I know I'm guilty of it even before I did triathlon, but I think that's a really valid point. But really, really interesting, Robin. Thank you so much for your time for that.
You're welcome.
Some interesting points there from Robin, and hopefully some things that you can actually take away. And it just proves how different athletes can be. And Robin has obviously coached the full spectrum of athletes, and it takes some time to work out the best taper for you. But I think it's time we actually spoke to a couple of athletes themselves to see how they deal with the taper. Now, you've probably noticed that Mark isn't here this week. Well, he's out having fun at Challenge Roth. So I've given him a job and I've asked him to go and speak to a couple to find out exactly how they hone their taper. So we're going to hear from pro athletes Jesse Thomas and Reece Barkley.
It depends on the distance, really. Going into a full distance Ironman, we'll start tapering just over 2 weeks before, and that will be just sort of gradually taking off a little bit of run volume, but we tend to navigate back to doing quite a lot more swimming during our taper because that's our roots, and we just find that works for us personally. We drop the volume up, the intensity. Different people have different methods of tapering, but when we were swimmers, that's always the way we did it. We backed off the volume and increased the intensity, and we've kept that with us through into triathlon. It seems to work well.
Sure, and then obviously, I don't know, taper is quite a big block of your training gone. Are you specific in how many times throughout the year you do that for certain races and whatnot?
Yeah, so we tend to peak probably twice, maybe 3 times a year, but a lot of the races we turn up for are what we would call training races, so serious training races like a half Ironman. We kind of back off a little bit, but very much use it as a training stimulus.
I like to race 2 to 3 weeks before and have a half distance of some kind. And so like this year I raced Challenge Heilbronn in Germany about 12 days ago. And so I won't really taper at all into that race, pretty much training up through it, doing my last big long distance, workouts a week before, and then going straight into the race, racing hard, and then usually doing a little bit of volume on the back of the race too. So after that race, I rode for about 90 minutes to 2 hours. So I get a little bit of that kind of like Ironman distance stuff on the race day. And then over that next 2 weeks is when I start to taper down. So instead of like a 4-hour ride a week before, I did like a 3-hour ride with a little bit less running, and all the same intensity, all the same kind of like, high, hard efforts, but just 2/3 of the volume.
Admittedly, it can be tempting to get excited when it comes to taper time because you've probably spent months being fatigued, training really hard and having no time. And suddenly you've got all this energy, you've got a bit more time and you think, yeah, I'm gonna get this done, that done. But just hang on because this is still a really important part of your training. And I'm not saying do nothing. It is really important to keep your mind and body stimulated, but think about it as a very important structure. So it's going to take a little bit of time to experiment with what works best for you. And this is when it's so important that you plan your season, work out which races you're going to really peak for, and then enjoy that period. It is the icing on the cake on top of that training. And we would love to know what taper works for you. As I said, everyone's different, so let us know in the comments section below. And if you want to catch other videos from GTN, just hit the globe to subscribe. And we've actually caught up with some pros to find out how they prepare just before their race. And that video is just here.